Hey, Mama. So we are continuing with, I don't even know if I named this series, but we're talking about all things like launching your podcast, simplifying it, making it stress free, and like the most important things you need to consider when launching your podcast. And so today I am sharing with you my stress free podcast launch checklist and really showing you like what you actually need to focus on, what you actually need to successfully and confidently launch your podcast. All right, let's jump into today's episode. Hey, Mama, are you tired of feeling stressed and overwhelmed trying to grow your online business with your babies at home? You desire more flexibility in your day, allowing you to pour into your family, yourself, and your business without running yourself into the ground. Mama, you can build your dream business and do it in a way that fits your current season of life. And I'm going to show you exactly how. Welcome to the Mama Turned Mompreneur podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Singletary, daughter of the king, wife, mama of two, and life and business coach for mompreneurs. On this podcast, you will learn business strategies made for mamas just like you, who desire to be successful CEOs and fully present mamas without stress or overwhelm. So whether you're an entrepreneur who transitioned to a mompreneur or a mama turned mompreneur, I am here to support you. So grab your coffee, notebook, and pen, put in those earbuds, and let's dig in. Okay, y'all, before we get into this episode, if my voice sounds horrible, I've been batch recording episodes. So literally this is the 6th episode I have recorded today. And I'm finishing after that, but I've really been trying to get ahead on my podcast content. Especially right now, both of my babies are sick. I don't know what they have brought home. But I'm anticipating that I'm probably going to get sick too. So I'm trying to like get ahead. And then that way I have a little wiggle room if I do get sick or end up losing my voice or something. So I am sorry my voice sounds like this. Definitely recording back-to-back episodes, it can affect your voice. So that's something to keep in mind if you're batch recording. But anyways, let's talk about my stress-free podcast launch checklist. And I really wanted to do this episode because so often when I am meeting with a new podcast launch client or have someone ask me about launching a podcast or even just, getting on sales calls with potential clients, a lot of the things that they focus on or are concerned with when it comes to launching their podcast, it's very overwhelming. And so it's not things that they need to necessarily focus on, especially when you're just launching your podcast. There are certain things that, yes, you absolutely need when you launch your podcast. And there are other things that you can add along the way, especially as you continue on your podcasting journey and you learn and you grow and you improve and you expand your podcast. So this is my stress-free podcast launch checklist. So the things that you absolutely need to have when launching your podcast: you need to have your podcast name. You need to have your cover art. You need to have a microphone for recording or your phone, whichever device you're going to use, a microphone or your phone, and you need headphones. Then you need recording and editing software. And it just like simple stuff. Like you don't need the works. You need a podcast host. So a hosting platform where you are going to upload your podcasts, like your edited podcast episodes, so that they are distributed to like Apple, Spotify, all of those places. And then the last thing is 3 to 6 months worth of content ideas. So I'm going to dive into each of these. So podcast name. This is something that you want to make sure you are searching ahead of time before you launch your podcast, because you have to make sure that somebody doesn't already have that as the name of their podcast, or they aren't using it as like the name of their business or something like that. Like you want to make sure it's not trademark. And I bring this up because this happened to one of my clients. she had selected a name for her podcast. And I did some research, and coming to find out, there was another podcast with that name. Now, coming to find out, that podcast host had stopped publishing episodes. They weren't using the name anymore. And so my client was able to go ahead and use the name and all of that. But that's something you really want to consider, because it would suck to be however many episodes in, even if you're only like 5-10 episodes in, and then to get like notify that somebody is already using that name is trademark. And so you want to make sure that you do that research ahead of time. Now, this is something in the Get It Done week we are going to be focusing on day one, because it is very important, because I don't want anybody, hitting publish on their podcast and then they have to go and change their name, especially after you've already gotten like so many episodes in and whatnot. And don't get me wrong, people rebrand and that kind of thing. But when you're just getting started, you don't want that headache. You want to make sure that you have all your T's crossed and your I's dotted. So we are going to make sure that the name you choose is one that is actually available. Cover art. This is important. Your cover art, it needs to have your face on it. And the reason why is that people are connecting with you through your podcast content. And especially if you're doing audio only, they can't see you, right? And so you want to have that cover art, that visual, so they know like, okay, this is the person I'm listening to each week. So you want to make sure you have like a professional headshot, like something that is clean and it looks good and it goes along with like whatever the theme is of your podcast. So for instance, Mama Turned Mompreneur. I have a picture of me and my kids because it's about running a business as a mom of littles. It makes sense when people look at my cover art, they resonate with it, especially probably like with having your kids on you while you're trying to get like some work done or whatever. Like it makes sense. It goes along with the theme of the podcast. Now in the Get It Done week, and I'm going to be talking about the Get It Done week throughout this episode, my graphic designer made some podcast cover art templates, and there's like quite a few that you guys can choose from. And you get to customize it. And these are professionally done cover art. She does the cover art for all of my podcast launch clients. And these are absolutely amazing. And so that is the nice thing, that you don't have to go and Canva and choose one of their little templates. Nah, when you join the Get It Done week, you get professionally made cover art templates that you can customize to match your brand. You could insert your picture and everything. So head on over to mamaturnedmompreneur.com/get it done to grab your spot. Like I said, we getting started January 22nd, y'all. Don't miss out. Okay, next thing. So recording. You need either a microphone or your cell phone and some headphones. Now, I say microphone or your phone because starting out, if you don't have the money to invest in a microphone, if you have a phone and it has like where you can record audio, it works perfectly fine. You guys may not know, but for a couple of episodes, like for interviews, like the intro to some of the interviews, I've recorded them on my phone because I did not feel like setting up my microphone, and both of my kids happened to be down for a nap, and I had like that small window to record the intro for the interview, and it sounded perfectly fine. So instead of getting caught up in all of the tech, if you have a perfectly good phone, so like for instance on the iPhone, there is a app where you can record voice notes or like audio. It works perfectly. You can get crisp audio. And the next thing when I get into recording and editing software, I'm going to share about a software that I use that helps level the audio, meaning that the audio is at the same level throughout the entire audio file. And that will help with that if you notice that like when you're recording, some parts the audio is higher and some parts the audio is lower. But you can really get away like with starting out using your phone. And then when you start making money from your podcast, or, you have the income to invest in a good microphone, you can do that. Also, the microphone I recommend, it's the Samson Q2U. It's like $57, $60 just for the microphone. So it's not even that expensive, and it's a really good one. But yeah, you just need either a microphone or phone and some headphones. That's it. Keep it simple. Like, you don't need to have this amazing setup. Like, I've shared this with you guys before. Like, I literally sit in my closet and record. My husband got rid of my box that I used to use to record, like have my setup on. So now I use his shoe boxes. So I have like two of his shoe boxes stacked, and then an empty box from my daughter's diaper wipes. So like my microphone is set up on the diaper wipes box, and then my laptop is sitting on the two shoe boxes that are stacked. Nothing fancy over here. But my audio sounds good, right? Like, you guys can hear me. It's not a bunch of background noise. If there is, it's not a big deal, but you guys can hear me clearly. My message is getting through. So you don't need a fancy setup. Okay, recording and editing software. So for editing and recording, you can use Audacity. I use Audacity for editing my podcast episodes, my podcast production clients' episodes. I use Audacity, and it's free. You just download it on your computer, and it is a bit, I don't want to say it's a learning curve. Like, if you've never done audio editing, it's going to be a learning curve. But honestly, one of the things I love about Audacity is that you can edit as you record. So literally, you can record. If you mess up, you pause Audacity, you can delete the part or remove the part where you messed up on, and then you hit record again and you start back recording, and it literally picks up where you left off. So it's really simple, and this is something that I'm going to be showing you guys in the Get It Done week, how to edit as you record, because that is going to save you so much time, especially if you are doing this on your own starting out. And hey, we are all about simplifying and making things easy. And so that's one of the things I'm going to show you is how to simplify and streamline that process. So that way, by the time you're done recording, the only editing you'll have to do is to add in your formal intro and outro, and that's it. So after you record and you do your editing, the program that I was referring to about leveling out your audio is Auphonic. I love Auphonic. I stand by Auphonic. It's so easy to use, and it really helps with making sure that your audio, it's level across. So I don't know, like, you may have heard some podcast episodes where maybe they don't use something like Auphonic. And so there's some parts where the audio is a bit higher and then other parts where it's a bit lower. And it's just not a good listener experience, right? So you want to make sure your audio is level. Auphonic does help somewhat with some of the background noises and just like cleaning up the audio a bit. I wouldn't rely heavily on it for that, but and it's a great thing. And it does have like where you can get 2 hours of free credit per month. I pay for it because I use it a lot with my podcast and with my clients' podcasts. But you do have that option, especially if you're only doing one episode a week and they're 30 minutes or less. Those 2 hours of credit is more than enough for you. Okay, podcast host. So, like I mentioned in the last episode, you do not have to get caught up in which podcast host to use. Just pick one. If you are wanting to pay for a podcast host, then you want to look at like what makes sense for your budget, right? I use Captivate, and it's one I recommend to my clients. I love Captivate. They have a very, very amazing customer support team. And just the features that they have are really great for supporting podcasters who are monetizing their podcasts. So whether you're doing it through sponsorships or through your own, paid offers, programs, services, products, all of that. They have a lot of great features. It's very user friendly, but at the end of the day, you just need to choose one. And if you choose one and you don't like it, it's so easy to switch to another one. Captivate, they tell you like on their website, like if you are switching from one host to them, They walk you through the entire process and they make it super easy. And I know that more podcast hosts are starting to highlight that on their websites because people are like starting to realize, oh, there are more options. I don't have to just use, Spotify for podcasters or just this one. So it's really easy to do. It's not complicated. And if you hit any like hiccups or anything, as long as you're choosing a podcast host that has a great support team. So like Captivate does. I know Buzzsprout does. I'm not going to talk about Libsyn. The last time I used Libsyn, their customer support was not that good. But Podbean also has a really great customer support. So you reach out to them, they'll walk you through it. It's pretty easy to do. But at the end of the day, just choose one so you can hit publish on your podcast. And then the last thing, 3 to 6 months worth of content ideas. This is how you ensure that you do not become a pod fade. If you don't know what a pod fade is, it's when you start a podcast, you post a few episodes, then you ghost your audience and they never hear from you again. The reason why that happens is, one, people start their podcast with no clear goals or intentions. They just say, hey, I want to start a podcast. Sounds really fun. Let's do this. 2, they don't know what to talk about. And so they start recording episodes. 3, they're not seeing the results that they want. And usually this is because they're not giving it enough time, or again, they do not have clear goals or intentions. So when it comes to creating that 3 to 6 months worth of content ideas, that's going to come from your goals and intentions for your podcast. What are you using this podcast for in your business? Are you using it to drive people to your paid offers and programs? Are you using it to drive people to your email list? Like, what are you using it for? And that's one of the things we get clear on during the Get It Done week, because it's literally going to drive your content and your call to actions in your podcast episodes. If you're not clear on that, it's not going to work for you. So, and I'm big on like planning out 3 to 6 months worth of content because it really gives you that wiggle room and it feels like it relieves you of that stress and anxiety because it's like, I know what I'm going to talk about my podcast for the next 3 to 6 months. And then you will see as you continue podcasting, baby, you are going to get ideas left and right. Like, I literally can be walking around at the park and an idea will come to me. I can be scrolling on Facebook and see somebody ask a question in a Facebook group and an idea will come to me. Now that I am further along in my podcast journey, my listeners ask me questions and I turn them into podcast episodes. The main thing is that when you're starting out, because you are new to the podcasting space, you want to at least have that bank of content ideas. So that way, at least for the next 3 to 6 months, you are covered on content. And during that 3 to 6 month period, you can generate more content ideas. Okay, so to kind of wrap this up, I just want to highlight the things you don't need to launch your podcast. Music for your intro and outro is not a necessity. And I know people are probably like, wait, what? It's not. And I say this because people are getting value from the actual meat of your episode. So as long as you are creating quality content in your podcast, an intro and outro is not a necessity. Now, during the Get It Done week, yes, I am going to show you how to create your intro and outro. I am actually providing you with the scripts. So that way it's literally like a plug and play. So that way you can easily script your intro and outro. But it's not necessary. You don't need the music. Like, it's not necessary. Now, as you continue, yes, you'll eventually want to add it. But I just want to highlight an example. So the Motherhood Simplified podcast, I worked with Krista early 2023. And when we started working together, she did not have a formal intro or outro. She literally just published her podcast episodes as is. And when we started working together, she was a top 1% podcast because she had so much value in her podcast content. Like, the mamas in her community were gaining so much from her podcast. They were learning how to effectively declutter. We didn't add a formal intro and outro to her podcast till we started working together. And I think by that point, when we started working together, she had her podcast like 2-3 years. So I just use that as an example that it's really about the quality of the content, the meat of your episode. That's what people are really tuning into. Eventually, your listeners, after they've listened to your podcast so many times, they're going to start fast forwarding through the intro. So they won't even listen to it because they just want to get to the good stuff. So if creating a formal intro or outro is like holding you up from launching your podcast, just put that off to the side. Don't worry about it. You don't have to do that right now. The next thing you don't need is a video podcast. I know video podcasts have become really big, but you don't need it because your podcast can still be published to Apple, to Spotify, to the major players in the podcasting space. And you can still actually add your podcast to YouTube. Like I shared in previous episodes, you just create a little thumbnail graphic and you have your podcast on YouTube. But you really don't need a video podcast. Like, it is not a necessity in order to launch your podcast. And I see this come up a lot in different communities when people are talking about starting a podcast and they're like, oh, but I need to make it a video podcast, but I don't even know what equipment I need. Don't do that to yourself. Like, that is just going to stress you out because you don't need it. Like, it's not a requirement to have a podcast. Like, podcast, the actual like definition of it, it's audio only content. Like, so you don't need the video part. The video, like, that's just more bells and whistles. Like, unless your podcast requires you to show people like how to do something, you don't really need it. And I know not everybody agrees with me, and that's fine. But hey, I have a top 2.5% podcast and I don't have any video. I am still generating leads for my podcast. I am signing clients from my podcast. I shared back in episode 120 how I literally launched my coaching business because of a podcast listener who came to me asking me to coach her on how to build out an offer for her podcast community. You can have that without a video podcast. All right. Last couple of things are expensive equipment. So like I touched on earlier, you just need either a microphone, and it doesn't have to be a super fancy one. Y'all don't need the Blue Yeti. I'm anti-Blue Yeti. That thing is horrible. I don't care what anybody says. It is not ideal for recording in your home. But you don't need expensive equipment. You don't need a studio setup. You can use your microphone or your phone and some headphones. And the last thing is that you don't need perfect audio. So, like I said, the main things that you need, like my stress-free podcast launch checklist, what you actually need to launch your podcast, the name of your podcast, your cover art, something to record with, whether that's a microphone or your phone and some headphones, recording and editing software, which can be something as simple as Audacity, which is free, and Auphonic. A podcast host. So this is where you're going to upload your podcast so that way it is pushed out to all of the podcast players like Apple, Spotify, all of the things. And then 3 to 6 months worth of content ideas. That is all you need, mama. Again, if you are like, okay, I'm ready to do this and you want support, join me next week for the 7-day pot launch Get It Done week. We are going to get it done. We are going to launch your podcast in 7 days, and literally it's going to be laid out for you. Each day, you're going to be given what you need to focus on, what you need to get done, so that way you can launch your podcast. Now, if you are, someone who's like, you know what, I'm going to get ahead, you are free to do that. Either way, like, you have me for 7 days where I am providing that live feedback. I am supporting you through anything that comes up. I am really supporting you with that strategy piece too. So that way this podcast is just not another thing on your plate, but an effective part of your business, effective part of your marketing strategy, your lead generation strategy. That's what you get in the Get It Done week. So head on over to mamaturnedmompreneur.com/get it done so we can get it done next week. Join me and the other amazing mamas who have already signed up, and I will catch you in the next episode. Well, Mama, that's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to hang with me. If you enjoyed today's episode, will you do me a favor and follow the podcast and leave a review? Hitting that follow button and sharing your thoughts about the podcast are the best ways to ensure that other mamas like you find this show. Your review also lets me know if you're enjoying this podcast, so make sure to share your thoughts before you go. All right, Mama, I'll catch you in the next episode.